no good deed goes unpunished. It's a sad commentary on life, but I'm afraid it might be true. Now, this phrase was originally attributed to playwright Oscar Wilde, although a lot of different authors picked this phrase up in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and we see it come about more recently as well. Franklin Adams wrote a satirical poem with this phrase as its title. John Mellencamp has picked up this sentiment and included it as a lyric in one of his songs, Crumbling Down. Broadway's hit musical Wicked actually has a song in the production called No Good Deed. Shoot, this is even in Star Trek. There's a scene where Riker uses this phrase with Picard, and he calls it Newton's fourth law of thermodynamics. But long before any of these folks spoke it, or wrote it, or sang it, Mordecai lived it. Yeah, no good deed goes unpunished certainly wins the day as we open our text up today, and we find two separate plots unfolding in scene 3 of our story. So take a look at Esther chapter 2, starting in verse 21. It says, during the time Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, became angry and conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. But Mordecai found out about the plot, and he told Queen Esther, who in turn reported it to the king, giving credit to Mordecai. And when the report was investigated and found to be true, the two officials were impaled on poles. And all of this was recorded in the book of the annals in the presence of the king. Now, this part of the story is pretty straightforward. Mordecai is sitting by the king's gate, as was his custom, as being one of the royal officials. He overhears two other officers, yes, these two men worked for the king as well, plotting to kill Xerxes. So Mordecai tells his cousin tells the king, there's an investigation, and the two men are killed, and Mordecai was credited with saving the king's life. But typically speaking, when you save the king's life, there's usually some kind of reward involved. I mean, this is no small matter. But it looks as if Mordecai, for now anyway, is just going to get a little mention on the official list of all the people who were loyal to the king. Ironically, though, at the very moment in the text when Mordecai should be receiving honors but isn't, there's another man who is being honored who shouldn't. It's time for us to meet our fifth and final character in our narrative, Haman. Now, right off the bat, we're offered some information here about Haman that stands in pretty stark contrast with Mordecai. It's altogether possible that the author is actually using this literary device of contrast to set up the impending conflict that's going to continue between these two men. So the first thing that we see is that these are the only two characters in the whole story who are introduced by their ancestral lineage. Now, we've already seen that Mordecai is a Jew from the tribe of Benjamin, and there's a potential connection to King Saul. We know that. But here we see Haman introduced as an Agagite. This means that he's likely a descendant from King Agag from the Amalekites. And if you know your Old Testament history, you know that these two kings, Saul and Agag, they opposed each other hundreds of years before Haman and Mordecai would have even met. But this information helps us realize just how long this generational conflict has been going on. Here's another contrasting factor. It's in their very names. Now, Mordecai has an etymology related to the Babylonian god Marduk, and his name essentially means warrior. But Haman's name, on the other hand, has a strong similarity to the Hebrew word wrath. It's pretty fitting. Finally, here's what we're about to see in the text. Mordecai willingly submits himself to an ultimate authority, while Haman grasps at any opportunity to become that ultimate authority. So back in the text at the start of chapter 3, we see that King Xerxes has deemed Haman fit to be his closest aide. In fact, Xerxes has commanded all of the other officials and officers to bow down to Haman out of respect. But there is one man who refuses to bow. You guessed it, Mordecai. Now, Haman, being a very proud and vile man, he decides that he's not only going to make Mordecai pay for his insubordination, but Mordecai's entire people. So in chapter 3, verse 7, we start to see Haman's plot unfolding. Now, just to give us a little bit of context here, it is now the 12th year of Xerxes' reign. So it's about 474 BC. Queen Esther has been queen for 5 years. And the text tells us that it's currently the first month of the year, which is the month of Nisan. Now, Haman, to get things going, he's going to cast the die and discover exactly what day this plot of destruction should take place. Now, this was a common form of divination used in biblical times, and the lot falls to the 12th month, the month of Adar. Now, with that figured out, he goes to the king, and this is what he proposes starting in verse 8. He says, "There is a certain people dispersed among all the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom, who keep themselves separate. Their customs are different from those of all the other people, and they do not obey the king's laws. It is not in the king's best interest to tolerate them. If it pleases the king, let a decree be issued to destroy them, and I will personally give 10,000 talents of silver to the king's administrators for the royal treasury." And I want you to notice the psychological attack that Haman makes on the king right here. I mean, this guy, he is a master manipulator. I mean, the first thing that Haman does is he uses the fear factor. He tells Xerxes that there's this people group. They're big, they're large, and they don't obey the king's laws. They stick to themselves, and they're kind of sketchy. This is essentially what he's saying. But in the history books, there is no proof, there's no evidence that the Jews in exile in Persia were rebellious in any way. Sure, they kept themselves separate. They were Jewish. They didn't partake in the same foods or customs or religious practices as all of the others in the other provinces, but they were largely permitted to keep to their own code. So they didn't break any laws. This is probably why Haman was so careful not to actually say that it was the Jews he was talking about, because Xerxes might have pushed back at the idea that this peaceful people group needed to be done away with. But then after the fear factor comes the fail factor. Haman offers to give the king a large sum of money if he'll give him the honor of doing away with this potential threat. But what Haman is doing here is he's simply reminding the king of the fact that his treasury has still not recovered from the massive defeat that he experienced at the hands of the Greeks. Now, you might think that the king would be offended by this, but it looks more like he's ashamed, because he responds exactly how Haman would have hoped he would. The king tells Haman to keep his money, and on top of that, Xerxes entrusts Haman with his signet ring. Now, this ring is the ring that holds all the power to seal any deal. And as we already know about the laws crafted by the king, they cannot be revoked. And so an edict was written in every language so that no one was left out. And the edict was sealed by the king's signet ring. And this edict was delivered to all of the provinces with the order to destroy, kill, and annihilate all of the Jews, young and old, women and children, on a single day, the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar. Now, these dates are not just ominous. These are significant. I mean, first of all, we know that the edict is being written in the first month, but the death sentence is going to be carried out in the 12th month. That means that for an entire year, the Jewish people are going to live in constant dread and anxiety and fear of what is coming their way. But that's not the only significant thing about these dates. The text tells us that the edict was delivered to the provinces on the 13th day of Nisan. But we learn from Leviticus 23 that the celebratory feast of Passover began on the 14th day of Nisan. Now, a part of me just kind of wants to throw up my hands at this point and say, seriously? Like, you couldn't even let them have that one thing? You had to ruin Passover too? Really? But then I just push pause, and I remember the words from Proverbs 16:33. It says, "The lot is cast into the lap, but its every decision is from the Lord." And this is such a good reminder of what we've already seen of God in this narrative. We know that one, even in the chaos, God is in control. And two, God is not just great. He's not just interested in the big picture. He's also good. He's in the details. And so perhaps God chose this day for the news to be announced, so that as the faithful Jews and followers are celebrating and they're remembering God's mighty deliverance for their ancestors out of the hands of their enemies in Egypt, maybe in this moment they'll be encouraged and they'll hold on to hope that God will do it again, right here, right now. But as this scene comes to a close, we see two very different reactions from the edict. Verse 15 says that the king and Haman sat down and had a drink, and that the city of Susa was bewildered. That's fair. No good deed goes unpunished. And no amount of plays or poems or songs can quite capture how true this is for Mordecai and Esther right now. I mean, is it me, or does it just seem like things are going from bad to worse? The odds are slowly being stacked against them. And for what? For being faithful? For being loyal? For being good? I mean, to live in a world where the fate of the people is decided not by law and justice, but by the personal agendas of the best manipulator? Can you imagine living in such an impulsive and unstable power? Well, I mean, maybe we can, a little bit. And I think that's just the point. See, the hostility of Haman toward Mordecai is a direct metaphor of the world's hostility against the people of God in general. And we shouldn't be surprised by this. Jesus warned his disciples in John chapter 16 that to follow him would mean that they would be no stranger to persecution and injustice. And in John 17, he reminds all of us of the difficulty of being planted in a world that just plain and simple is not our home. And so to remain faithful in the face of faithlessness, it's not going to be easy for the Jews in Susa. And it's not always easy for us either. But remember Jesus' exhortation at the end of John chapter 16. He said, "In this world you will have trouble, but take heart, because I have overcome the world." And it's true. The marginalized Israelites in the book of Esther, they're not only going to survive, they're going to rise to power. See, God made a promise to carry his people through to the end, and he has not failed us yet. But the question remains, what do we do in the meantime? Well, here's what the author of the book of Hebrews shared with those who were being persecuted in the early church. And I think these words are valuable for us as well. Hebrews chapter 6, verses 10 through 12 says, "God is not unjust. He will not forget your work and the love that you have shown him as you have helped his people and continue to help them. We want each of you to show this same diligence to the very end, so that what you hope for may be fully realized. We do not want you to become lazy, but to imitate those who through faith and patience inherit what has been promised." So, how do you live well in a world where you don't belong? Be diligent in helping others. Be patient in affliction. And believe that God can be trusted, because he can be trusted. Well, this story is far from over, friends, and I'm excited to share what happens next with you. But in the meantime, would you rest in this truth, that you are known, you are loved, and you are cared for by a God who can be trusted.